My name is Grace Sullivan, though for the last 20 years almost no one has called me that. Tonight I am standing in the dining room of my father's inn, in a dress that cost more than most of the guests in this room make in a month, holding a folder that is about to end the only life my sister has built since she took mine away. She is 3 tables from me, laughing at something the mayor said, thanking her guests for coming to celebrate 50 years of a house she does not actually deserve to own. She thinks I am a stranger, a hospitality investor named Margot Reyes, who arrived at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right amount of money. She has no idea how long I have been waiting for tonight. In 4 minutes, the woman my sister has become will learn 2 things at once. The first is that the deal she signed to save this inn was never about saving it at all. The second is that the folder in my hand holds 20 years of proof that she took everything from me on purpose, and that she has never once lost a night of sleep over it. Before I open it, and before you watch her world come apart in front of everyone she has ever tried to impress, you need to understand exactly what she did to earn this moment. Before we continue, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching this from. If you enjoy powerful stories of betrayal, justice, redemption, and unforgettable life-changing twists, make sure you subscribe to StoryMind, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that stays with you long after it's over. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories every week. Now, let's get back to the story. To understand why I was standing in that room tonight, you have to go back 20 years, to a house on the coast of Maine, where 2 sisters were raised under the same roof and never once felt like they were raised the same way. My father, Walter Sullivan, built the Sullivan Inn with his own hands in the early 70s, first with my mother, and after she passed, with the woman who would become my stepmother and give him me. My sister Patricia was 12 years older, and from the moment I was born, she watched our father hand me the parts of this place he loved most, while she was handed the ledgers, and the ledgers alone. I did not understand, until it was far too late, that a childhood spent being told, "You are the responsible one," while your younger sister is told, "She is the beloved one," can turn into a debt that someone decides, one day, to collect. What Patricia did to collect it took away my inheritance, my fiancé, my name in the only town I had ever called home, and very nearly my freedom. For 20 years I have carried 3 questions that would not let me rest. How does a woman convince an entire community that her own sister is a thief when she is the one holding the pen? What does it take to survive being erased from your own family's story? And when you finally have the proof to take it all back, is there a way to do it that does not turn you into the very thing you are trying to expose? Tonight, in that dining room, I was about to find out whether 20 years of patience had prepared me for the answer, or whether some debts cannot be collected without a price of their own. Before any of this happened, I was 29 years old and certain my life was exactly where it was supposed to be. I ran the front desk and the guest relations side of the Sullivan Inn, the job my father had given me the year I turned 22, back when I still thought it was simply because I loved the place the way he did. I knew every regular guest by name, which room faced the water best in October, and which of our 7 rooms had the stubborn radiator that needed a firm knock instead of a gentle one. I was engaged to Ethan Cole, a contractor who had spent 2 summers restoring the carriage house on our property, and who used to tell me, half joking, that he had fallen in love with the inn before he ever fell in love with me. Ethan and I met the summer I turned 26, when my father hired his crew to restore the carriage house that guests kept asking to rent, instead of the main building. He used to take his lunch break on the porch steps outside the front desk window, and it took him nearly a month to work up the nerve to ask me to dinner, which I found unbearably charming at the time, and still do, looking back. We built a life together slowly, the way people do in small towns, running into each other at the grocery store, and the hardware store, and the diner on Water Street, until running into each other stopped feeling like an accident and started feeling like a plan. I remember thinking, the year before my father died, that I had never been more certain of anything than I was of the life Ethan and I were building together. My father, Walter, was the kind of man who remembered a guest's anniversary better than his own. He had built this inn from nothing after coming home from the Navy, and by the time I was old enough to understand what it meant to him, it was already the only inheritance that mattered in our family. My sister Patricia managed the books, a job she had held since she was in her 20s, and did it with a precision that never once slipped in front of a guest or an auditor. What I did not see, because I had never been taught to look for it, was how much it cost her to spend 3 decades keeping the numbers straight for a business our father always spoke about, as though it belonged to me first and her second. I remember a dinner, maybe 8 months before he died, when my father told the table he was finally ready to put my name on the deed alongside his, so that when the time came, the transition would be simple. He said it warmly, the way he said everything, certain it would make everyone at that table happy. Patricia smiled and refilled everyone's wine and said all the right things, and it was only years later, replaying that night in my memory, that I noticed she had not eaten another bite of her dinner after he said it. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I had spent my whole life watching my sister carry more responsibility than anyone ever thanked her for, and it did not occur to me that responsibility and love are not always the same currency, and that a person can resent you for having one while she was only ever given the other. I do have one clear memory, from when I was 7 and Patricia was 19, of her teaching me to set a formal breakfast table, the way our father insisted on for the inn's paying guests, patiently correcting my hand each time I placed a fork on the wrong side. She was not unkind to me as a child. If anything, she was more patient with me than most 19-year-olds would have been with a little sister who followed her everywhere. It makes what happened later harder to explain simply, and harder still to reduce to any single, clean reason. Whatever grew between us over the following 2 decades did not start as cruelty. It started, I think, as something much quieter and much harder to notice in time. My father's heart had been failing quietly for almost 2 years before any of us admitted out loud how serious it had become. In the last few months, Patricia began handling more of his correspondence, driving him to appointments, and sitting in on meetings with Arthur Kessler, the attorney who had handled our family's affairs since before I was born. I was grateful for it. I told myself I was lucky to have a sister willing to carry that weight, so I could spend what time was left simply being his daughter instead of his caretaker. I did not think to ask why. On 2 occasions that spring, the notary who came to the house to review paperwork was not Arthur himself, but a colleague of his I had never met, filling in, Patricia said, while Arthur was traveling. My father died in March, in his sleep, in the room at the top of the inn where he had slept, every night for 40 years. The whole town came to his funeral, because that is the kind of man he was, the kind whose absence is felt by people who only ever knew him as the man who remembered their coffee order. Patricia and I held each other at that funeral and cried together in a way I had not expected, and for a few days afterward, grief made us closer than we had been in years. I remember thinking, foolishly, that whatever distance had grown between us over the decades might finally close now that we only had each other left. The reading of his will was scheduled for the following week, and I walked into Arthur Kessler's office that morning without the smallest suspicion that I was about to lose everything I thought I understood about my own family. Ethan and I had chosen the last Saturday in June for our wedding, and my father had spent the better part of a year quietly planning to host it in the garden behind the inn, the same garden where he had married both of his own wives. I used to walk through that garden in the evenings and try to picture where the chairs would go, who would stand whether my father would cry during the toast, the way he cried at every wedding he had ever hosted for other people's daughters. It is strange, looking back, how much of my identity at 29 was built around a version of my life that assumed the ground beneath it would always hold. I had no reason yet to imagine what it would feel like to have that ground taken from me by the one person I trusted enough to never look twice at. There was a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Abernathy who had been coming to the inn every October for 11 years, always requesting the room with the window seat, always bringing me a jar of beach plum jam from her garden the moment she arrived. She used to tell me I reminded her of my father more than my own sister did, meant as the highest compliment she knew how to give, and I used to laugh it off, though some part of me treasured hearing it every single year. I think about her sometimes now, and about how many small, ordinary kindnesses like hers made up the reputation I did not yet understand I was about to lose. Bellhaven is a small town, the kind where reputations move faster than the ferry that brings tourists in from the mainland every summer. Everyone in Bellhaven knew the Sullivan family, and most of them had stayed in one of our rooms at some point in their lives, or danced at a wedding my father hosted, or borrowed his truck when their own broke down. That kind of intimacy is a gift when people love you, and it is a weapon when they turn against you, though I did not understand that yet. I only knew that my name meant something good in that town, the way my father's had for 40 years before me, and it never once occurred to me that a reputation built over a lifetime could be undone in the space of a single afternoon, by someone who understood exactly how the town's trust worked, because she had watched my father earn it her entire life. Arthur Kessler read the will in a voice that started steady and grew quieter with every paragraph, until he reached a clause dated 6 weeks before my father's death, a codicil none of us had heard mentioned before that morning. It stated, in language far more careful than anything my father would have chosen himself, that full ownership of the Sullivan Inn, along with its accounts, its property, and its name, would pass entirely to Patricia. I was named in one sentence, thanking me for my years of service to the family business, and nothing more. I remember looking at Patricia across that office, waiting for her to look as confused as I felt, waiting for her to say there had been some mistake. Instead, she reached over and put her hand on mine, and told me, gently, that she was sure our father had his reasons, and that we would figure it out together. That night I went to the house and asked her directly whether she had known about the codicil before that morning. She told me she had suspected our father was making changes, given how much time he had spent alone with Arthur that spring, but that she had never asked and never seen the documents herself. I wanted to believe her. She was my sister, and grief makes people want easy explanations more than they want the truth. It would be years before I understood that the calm, steady way she answered every hard question that week was not the composure of someone processing loss alongside me, but the composure of someone who had spent months rehearsing exactly how this conversation would go, long before our father ever stopped breathing. 10 days after the will reading, 2 things happened within an hour of each other. Arthur Kessler called to say the bank had flagged irregular withdrawals from the inn's operating account, dating back nearly a year, all made under a login registered to me. And a Bellhaven police officer, a man who had known my father for 20 years, showed up at the inn to ask me questions about roughly $40,000 that had gone missing from guest deposits and vendor payments. I had never made those withdrawals. I did not even know the passwords Patricia said had been used, because those accounts had been her responsibility for years, not mine. But my name was on the transactions, my employee login had been used, and to everyone standing in that office that day, the math looked simple, even though none of it was true. Word travels fast in a town where everyone has stayed under your family's roof at least once. Within a week, I was charged with embezzlement from a business that bore my own last name, and within 2 weeks, half the guests who used to ask for me by name at the front desk were calling the inn to ask Patricia if the rumors were true. She never once said anything false out loud. She simply looked heartbroken every time someone asked, said she could not believe it either, and let the silence between her words do the rest of the damage for her. I learned then how easily a reputation built over a lifetime can be undone, not by a lie shouted loudly, but by a truth quietly withheld, delivered by someone the town already trusted completely. Ethan told me, 3 weeks into the accusations, that he needed time to think, and that he could not marry into a scandal that might follow us for the rest of our lives, whether or not it turned out to be true. I remember asking him directly whether he believed I had done it. He would not answer the question. He said only that he did not know what to believe anymore, and that Patricia had always struck him as the more careful, more honest of the two of us. It was the first moment I understood that the version of me people had trusted for 29 years could be replaced by a different version, built entirely out of suspicion and silence, faster than I could have imagined possible. The district attorney eventually agreed to drop the criminal charges in exchange for my signing away any claim to the inn or its accounts, a settlement my own attorney urged me to accept, since proving my innocence outright would have taken years and money I no longer had. I signed it in a conference room I had once helped decorate for one of my father's birthday parties, and I understood, signing it, that I was not just losing a business. I was agreeing, on paper, to disappear from the story of my own family in exchange for staying out of a courtroom. Within a month, I had packed what fit in my car and left Bellhaven, the town where every single person had once known my name for the right reasons. The night before I left, packing the last box from my childhood bedroom, I found a torn scrap of paper tucked inside an old guest ledger my father had kept for sentimental reasons long after we switched to computers. It was a page of handwritten figures, in handwriting that was not Patricia's careful, practiced print, and not mine either. The numbers on it did not match the numbers the bank had used to charge me. I had no idea, that night, whose handwriting it was, or what those figures actually meant. I only knew, holding that scrap of paper in a bedroom I would never sleep in again, that something about the story I had just been forced to accept was not the whole truth. I put it in the bottom of a suitcase, and for 20 years, I never once stopped wondering what it would take to find out who had written it. I settled first in Providence, then in Boston, in small apartments I could barely afford, working nights as a hotel desk clerk, under a name that was not the one my father gave me. I chose Margot because it was close enough to feel like mine, and Reyes because it was my mother's maiden name from a grandmother I had barely known, a small private way of keeping something real inside a name I had built to protect myself. For the first 2 years, I told almost no one where I had come from. I let people believe I simply preferred not to talk about my past, which was, in its own way, entirely true. I spent those first years doing exactly the kind of quiet, careful work my sister had once done for our family's inn, except I was doing it for other people's failing properties, learning hospitality finance and turnaround management one-night class, and one borrowed textbook at a time. I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was good at it, that I could look at a struggling property's books and see exactly where the story being told to guests did not match the numbers being kept in private. I do not think it is an accident that the skill I built to survive was the same skill someone had once used against me. I simply decided to spend it honestly. By my mid-30s, Margot Reyes had a small reputation of her own in the world of independent hospitality investment, the kind built quietly, one successful restructuring at a time, never with my face in a magazine or my name in a headline. I bought struggling inns and bed and breakfasts along the East Coast, most of them family businesses one bad season away from losing everything, and I helped the families who owned them keep what mattered most while fixing what had gone wrong underneath. I told myself, for a long time, that I had built this life simply to survive, and it took me years longer than it should have to admit that some part of me had built it, piece by piece, to one day be strong enough to go back. Building Margot Reyes into a real, credible life took more from me over the years than the work itself ever did. I dated occasionally under my new name, but never let anyone close enough to ask questions about a past I could not fully explain. I never had children, in part because every year I spent building the case against my sister felt like a year I could not also spend building anything else. There were nights, especially around the anniversary of my father's death, when I wondered whether I had simply traded one kind of loss for another, exchanging the life Patricia had taken from me for a different life I had built entirely around the plan to take it back. There was a month, about 6 years into building my new life, when a Bellhaven attorney, working an unrelated real estate matter, contacted my firm directly, having recognized my handwriting on a document from a deposition years earlier that had somehow crossed his desk. I spent 3 sleepless nights, convinced my identity was about to unravel before I had gathered nearly enough proof to make use of it. It turned out to be nothing more than a coincidence of similar penmanship, but the fear of it taught me exactly how fragile the life I had built really was, and how carefully I would need to move for however many more years this search required. The turn came in a way I never expected, 9 years after I left Bellhaven, during a restructuring project for a small resort in Vermont owned by a family named Halloran. The Halloran matriarch, going through her own family's financial records during our work together, mentioned almost in passing that her late husband's cousin had once been forced out of a family business in Maine under circumstances she described as embezzlement, though she had always privately doubted it. When she said the name of the town, and then the name of the woman who had taken over the business, I had to excuse myself from that meeting and sit alone in my car for almost an hour before I trusted myself to speak again. I asked the Halloran matriarch, as carefully as I could, without revealing why it mattered so much to me, whether her husband's cousin had ever considered pursuing the matter further. She told me the cousin had been advised by her own family to simply move on and be grateful for what she still had left, advice I recognized immediately, because it was almost word for word what well-meaning people in Bellhaven had once told me. I did not tell the Hallorans that night who I really was, or why their offhand family story had left me shaking in a parked car. I only knew, driving back to my hotel, that I finally had a thread worth pulling. It took me another 8 months, working quietly and carefully so as not to draw attention back to myself, to confirm what that offhand comment had suggested. Patricia had done almost exactly the same thing once before, years before our own falling out, to a distant cousin who had briefly co-owned a small property with her in the early days before she came to run our father's inn full-time. The cousin had settled quietly, moved away, and never spoken of it publicly, exactly the way I had been pressured to. I finally understood that what had happened to me was not a single act of desperation from a grieving woman. It was a method, one my sister had used before and would likely use again, refined a little further each time. That discovery sent me back to the suitcase I had carried through 4 apartments and 2 states, to the torn scrap of ledger paper I had never been able to throw away. I finally had it examined by a document specialist I trusted from my restructuring work, someone used to identifying inconsistencies in financial paperwork for a living. She confirmed what I had suspected, without proof, for 9 years. The handwriting on that page did not belong to Patricia. It belonged to someone else who had access to the inn's real books during the exact period the falsified withdrawals were supposedly made. Someone whose name did not appear anywhere in the official records the bank and the district attorney had relied on to charge me. It took a private investigator I hired under my Margot Reyes identity almost a year to identify her. Marjorie Ellison had worked as a junior bookkeeper under Patricia for 18 months, the exact window when the falsified transactions occurred, before leaving the inn abruptly and moving to Portland. She had never testified, never been interviewed by the police, and as far as the official record was concerned, she had never existed in connection with the case against me at all. When I finally found her, she was in her early 70s, living alone, and it took 3 visits before she agreed to speak with me honestly about what she remembered from those 18 months at the Sullivan Inn. Marjorie told me, sitting in her small kitchen in Portland, that she had noticed discrepancies in the guest deposit accounts almost as soon as she started, numbers that did not match what she had been trained to expect, entered under a login she had been told was standard practice for training purposes. She said Patricia had told her the discrepancies were simply an old accounting method being phased out, nothing worth reporting. It was only years later, reading about my case in a local paper, long after I had already left town, that Marjorie realized the login she had used during training was mine, and that the numbers she had been asked not to worry about were the very numbers used to accuse me. Marjorie had never come forward, she told me, because Patricia had quietly paid off the remainder of Marjorie's mother's medical debt the same month Marjorie left the inn, a kindness Marjorie had only understood years later as something closer to a payment for silence. She warned me that at least one other person, years before, had tried to raise questions about Patricia's bookkeeping and had simply stopped, after a private conversation with Patricia that no one else was ever told the details of. She asked me directly whether I understood what I would be taking on if I tried to expose a woman who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much silence could be bought and exactly how much a town's trust was worth. Somewhere in those years of quiet searching, my reasons for wanting the truth changed without my fully noticing. In the beginning, I wanted it because I was angry, because 29-year-old Grace had been humiliated and erased and wanted the world to know it. By the time I found Marjorie Ellison, what I wanted most was for my father's name to mean what it had always meant, and for the inn he built with his own hands to stand for the truth he actually lived by, rather than the version of events his older daughter had constructed to take it from his younger one. I told her I understood, though the truth was I would not fully understand it until months later. What I did know, sitting in that kitchen, was that I finally had what I had spent 20 years without, a witness willing to speak, and proof that did not depend on anyone believing me over my own sister. Around that same time, through channels entirely separate from my search for Marjorie, my firm had already identified the Sullivan Inn as a distressed property, its debts quietly growing under Patricia's management, its 50th anniversary approaching as the deadline by which she needed new investment or risked losing the business entirely, this time to a bank instead of a sister. It would have been easy, at that point, simply to hand everything I had found to a lawyer and let the courts sort out what remained of the truth. But I had spent 20 years watching my sister control every version of our story that reached the people who mattered to her, and I was not willing to hand her one more chance to control this one. If I was going to take back what she had taken from me, I decided I wanted to be standing in the room when she finally understood who had done it, and why. So instead of a lawyer, I sent an email, under the name Margot Reyes, expressing interest in a private investment in the Sullivan Inn. I stood in the lobby of the Sullivan Inn for the first time in 20 years on a grey morning in early spring, and it took every bit of composure I had built over 2 decades not to let my face show what it meant to be standing there again. The front desk had been moved to the other side of the room. The wallpaper my father had chosen was gone, replaced by something more modern and considerably less warm, and Patricia walked toward me with her hand extended, smiling the same practiced, welcoming smile she had used on guests my entire childhood, with absolutely no recognition in her eyes at all. She thanked me for making the trip up from Boston and told me, within the first 10 minutes, more about the inn's financial difficulties than I suspect she meant to reveal to a stranger, the kind of oversharing that happens when a person has been carrying a burden alone for longer than they can manage. She mentioned the 50th anniversary gala twice in that first conversation, each time with the same forced brightness, as though saying the word celebration enough times might make the debts underneath it disappear. I recognized that particular kind of performance immediately. I had watched her give it to guests my whole life, and I understood, sitting across from her now, exactly how much she needed my firm's investment to work. She showed me through the property, as though I were any other investor, walking me past the dining room, where my father used to greet every guest personally, past a hallway where a photograph of him still hung, slightly crooked, exactly where it had hung 20 years earlier. I had to look away from that photograph twice during the tour. Patricia noticed me looking and told me, without any weight in her voice at all, that the man in the photograph had been her father, the founder, gone now for 20 years, and that she had worked very hard to honor his legacy. I said nothing. I had waited 2 decades to hear her describe what she had done to his legacy, and I was not ready yet to hear the rest of that sentence out loud. Over the following weeks, I met with Patricia 6 more times to finalize the terms of the investment, and each meeting was its own small test of my composure. She kept a framed photograph on her office desk of the 2 of us as children, taken the summer I turned 8, and I found myself looking at it every single time I sat across from her, searching her face for some flicker of the sister I remembered from before either of us understood what the inn would eventually cost us both. I never found it. What I found instead was a woman entirely focused on saving what she had built, with no visible room left over to wonder what had become of the sister she once had. By this point in my search, I had assembled everything I needed. The document specialist had confirmed in writing that the handwriting on the torn ledger page belonged to Marjorie Ellison, not to me, and matched entries from the exact period the falsified withdrawals occurred. Marjorie herself had signed a sworn statement describing the training login she had been given, the discrepancies she had noticed, and the quiet payment toward her mother's medical debt that had followed her departure. Combined with banking records I had obtained showing the substitute notary Patricia arranged had no verified license on file with the state during the month the codicil was signed, I had, for the first time in 20 years, a case that did not depend on anyone simply choosing to believe me over my sister. The person who surprised me most during those weeks of negotiation was Sophie, Patricia's daughter, 24 years old, and running the inn's guest relations exactly the way I once had. She had her mother's careful attention to detail, and none of the guardedness, greeting every guest by name within a day of meeting them, and genuinely proud of the business she believed her mother had built from nothing after her grandfather passed. I found myself liking her more than I expected to, and hating, more than I expected to, the fact that exposing her mother meant this young woman was about to learn something about her family that would reshape everything she believed about where she came from. Sophie and I spent one long afternoon together, going through old reservation records for a database migration my firm was overseeing, and somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, without either of us planning it, she began telling me about her own dreams for the inn, ideas her mother had always been too cautious or too tired to consider. I recognized, listening to her, the exact same love for this place that I had once carried myself at her age, undamaged by anything that had happened before she was born. It became harder, that afternoon, to think of what was coming as simply justice for what had been done to me, and easier to think of it as something that was also about to cost this particular young woman more than she had any reason to deserve. It was Sophie, not Patricia, who first noticed something did not add up. During a walkthrough of the property's older records room, she mentioned, almost as a joke, that I seemed to already know my way around the building better than a first-time visitor should. I told her my firm always did thorough research before an investment, and she accepted that easily enough at the time. But 2 days later, she asked me, more directly, whether I had ever been to Bellhaven before this project, and something in the careful way she watched my face while asking made it clear the question was not entirely idle curiosity. I told myself, driving back to my hotel that night, that a first-time investor might plausibly know her way around unfamiliar property records if she had simply reviewed the file thoroughly enough in advance. I am not sure Sophie believed that explanation, even as she accepted it out loud, and I understood, replaying the conversation later, that I had underestimated how closely a young woman raised in that particular family had learned to watch for the small inconsistencies other people missed. The following week, going through a box of old guest photographs for a display planned for the anniversary gala, Sophie found a picture from a wedding at the inn decades earlier and asked me, half laughing, whether I had a sister who looked like the young woman in the photo standing beside her grandfather, because something about the way that young woman held her coffee cup reminded her, oddly, of the exact way I held mine. I laughed it off as she had laughed off my earlier deflection, but I understood, walking away from that conversation, that I was running out of time to control how and when the truth came out. I had originally planned to finalize the investment quietly, complete the acquisition, and only reveal my identity once the deal and the evidence were both fully secured, on my own timeline. Sophie's growing suspicion changed that calculation. If she connected the truth on her own, before I was ready, I risked losing control of a story I had spent 20 years preparing to tell honestly and completely. I decided, 3 days before the anniversary gala, that the reveal would happen there, in front of the entire town and the reporters Patricia had personally invited to cover what she believed would be the celebration of her greatest professional achievement. The night before the gala, I sat alone in a hotel room 20 minutes from the inn, the folder of evidence spread across the bed in front of me, and asked myself the same question I had been avoiding for 20 years. I knew, without doubt, that what I was about to do would end my sister's ownership of our father's inn, and very possibly her standing in the only town she had ever called home. What I did not know, and would not know until the following evening, was whether Sophie would ever be able to forgive the woman standing in front of her when the truth finally came out, or whether I was about to lose the only relationship I had built in Bellhaven in 20 years before it had even properly begun. The dining room was full by 7 that evening, exactly as it had been described to me weeks earlier, decorated with 50 years of photographs pulled from boxes I remembered from childhood, half the town in their best clothes, and 3 reporters from regional papers seated near the front at Patricia's personal invitation. Patricia stood to give her remarks first, thanking the town for 50 years of support, thanking her late father for the vision that started it all, and thanking, with real warmth in her voice, the investment partner who had arrived, she said, at exactly the moment the inn needed her most. She gestured toward me as she said it, and the whole room turned to look at Margot Reyes, exactly as I had planned they would. I stood, thanked her for the kind introduction, and told the room I had one more thing to add to the evening's celebration before the toast. I opened the folder I had carried in with me and told them that before they raised their glasses to 50 years of the Sullivan Inn, they deserved to hear the truth about how ownership of that inn had actually changed hands 20 years earlier. I watched Patricia's smile hold for exactly as long as it takes a person to realize the ground beneath a room has shifted, and then I told them my real name. I am Grace Sullivan, I told them, Walter Sullivan's younger daughter, the same Grace who left this town 20 years ago after being accused of a crime I did not commit, in a case built entirely on falsified records and a forged codicil to my father's will. I watched recognition move across the room in waves, older guests placing my face against a memory of a young woman who used to know their coffee order, reporters' pens moving faster, and Patricia standing perfectly still, the colour leaving her face in a way she could not have rehearsed, because she had never once imagined this particular moment happening in front of an audience. I introduced the room to a sworn statement from a woman named Marjorie Ellison, who had worked the inn's books during the exact months the falsified withdrawals occurred, and who was, at that moment, standing quietly near the back of the room at my invitation, willing to answer any question anyone in that room wanted to ask her directly. I showed them documentation proving the notary who processed my father's final codicil held no valid license during the month it was signed, and I told them that a torn page of financial records kept in my possession for 20 years matched Marjorie's handwriting exactly, and told a very different story than the one used to force me out of my own family's business. Patricia tried, for a moment, to recover the way she always had, telling the room this was clearly some kind of misunderstanding, that grief does strange things to families, that surely we could discuss this privately, rather than in front of guests. But the room had already stopped being hers to manage. A reporter asked her directly whether she was disputing the authenticity of the documents I had just shown them, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my sister stand in front of an audience with absolutely nothing composed to say. I watched Sophie's face longer than I watched anyone else's in that room. I saw the exact moment she stopped hearing this, as a story about a stranger, and started hearing it as a story about her own mother. The same, slow, physical understanding I remembered from the day I sat in Arthur Kessler's office 20 years earlier, and realized the ground I was standing on was not solid after all. She did not look at me with anger. She looked at her mother with a kind of grief I recognized immediately, because it was the same grief I had carried out of that very building 2 decades before. Patricia left the dining room without finishing her sentence, and no one tried to stop her. The 3 reporters who had come expecting a celebratory story about 50 years of family hospitality left instead with the story that would run in every regional paper by the following morning, a story about a woman who had waited 20 years to prove that the sister she had been accused of stealing from was, in fact, the one who had been stolen from all along. I stood in that room, surrounded by people who had known me my entire childhood, and felt, for the first time in 20 years, that the version of my story people believed was finally, completely true. Sophie found me nearly an hour later, after most of the guests had gone, sitting alone at the small back table where my father used to eat breakfast every morning before the inn opened for the day. She did not ask me to explain everything. She only asked whether it was true that I had once been engaged to be married in the garden behind the building we were sitting in, and when I told her yes, she was quiet for a long moment before saying that she wished, more than anything, that she had gotten the chance to know that version of the family instead of the one she had actually grown up inside of. Within days, the story picked up by those reporters reached a probate attorney I had retained months earlier in anticipation of exactly this outcome, and a motion to reopen my father's estate on the grounds of fraud was filed before the end of that week. It would take several more months of hearings before a judge formally restored my legal claim to a share of the inn and voided the codicil that had erased me from my father's will. But the moment that mattered most had already happened in that dining room, in front of the only audience that had ever needed to hear the truth. Whatever the courts eventually decided about the ownership of the building, I had already taken back the only thing Patricia could never put back in place herself, which was the truth of what actually happened to me. The probate court's ruling, when it finally came, gave me a formal ownership stake in the Sullivan Inn and full legal acknowledgement that the original embezzlement charges against me had been based on fraudulent evidence. Patricia, facing both the collapsed investment deal and mounting legal fees, chose to sell her remaining interest in the property rather than fight a battle she had no real chance of winning in the court of public opinion or the actual courts. The bank that had once threatened to foreclose on her instead worked out new terms directly with me and my firm, and the Sullivan Inn remained standing, under my ownership, exactly as my father would have wanted, even if the path to get there looked nothing like either of us could have imagined. I did not see Patricia again in person after that night at the gala. She moved out of Bellhaven within the year, and the few updates I received came second-hand, through people who still lived in town. I have thought often, in the time since, about whether she ever felt the years she spent managing our father's affection as unfairly divided as I now understand they were, and whether that unfairness, real as it may have been, could ever have justified what she did to correct it. I do not think it did. But I have stopped needing her to agree with me about that in order to feel at peace with how the story ended. Sophie stayed in Bellhaven, and after several long conversations I did not rush her through, asked whether she could keep working at the inn under my ownership instead of her mother's. She runs guest relations today, with the same warmth I remember having at her age, and we have built, slowly and carefully, the kind of relationship that does not erase what her mother did, but does not require her to carry the weight of it either. She told me once that she thinks of the inn now as belonging to both of our family's better instincts, rather than either woman's worst ones, and it is, I think, the closest thing to a healthy ending this story could have produced. Ethan reached out once, a few months after the story ran in the regional papers, to apologize for not believing me 20 years earlier, when it would have mattered most. I appreciated the apology more than I expected to, though I understood, hearing his voice again after 2 decades, that the version of us who had planned a wedding in that garden belonged entirely to a different life than the one I had built since. We spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, wished each other well, and have not spoken since, which feels, to me, like exactly the right kind of ending for that particular chapter. The town of Bellhaven, in the way small towns often do, absorbed the truth quickly and thoroughly once it arrived. Long-time guests, who had once quietly avoided the inn during the years of scandal, began writing to me directly, some apologizing for believing the version of events they had been given, others simply welcoming me home in language warmer than I expected after 20 years away. I do not think reputation, once broken, is ever restored to exactly its original shape. But I have come to believe that a true story, told completely and told once, in front of the people who mattered, is worth more than the comfortable half-truth I might have spent the rest of my life quietly living inside instead. People sometimes ask me whether the 20 years were worth it, as though the answer could be a simple yes or no. The truth is more complicated than that. I gained back my name, my father's inn, and something close to peace, but I also spent 2 decades of my one life carrying a secret and a plan instead of simply living, missing years I can never get back, with people who might have believed me sooner if I had found the proof faster, or trusted someone with the truth instead of carrying it entirely alone. I do not regret what I did, but I have learned not to describe it, even to myself, as a story with a clean and easy victory at the end of it. What I know for certain is that Marjorie Ellison, the woman whose quiet courage finally made my case possible, still comes by the inn every few months for coffee, and that my father's photograph hangs exactly where it always did, no longer crooked. I think about him often, and about whether he would have wanted either of his daughters to spend 20 years the way we each spent ours. I do not have a clean answer for that either. I only know that I would ask you the same question I still ask myself some mornings, standing in that dining room before the guests arrive. If you had waited 20 years for a moment like the one I finally got, would it have felt like justice to you, or like something you had already paid for twice, long before you ever collected it? Thank you for watching Story Mind. If this story touched your heart or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in this situation? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe to Story Mind, and share this video with someone who loves unforgettable storytelling. Until next time, remember, every choice has a story, and every story leaves a lesson.